The gravel was frozen hard enough that the buggy wheels made a sound like teeth grinding. 4 miles to church. 40 minutes in the dark before the sun came up. My husband had the reins in one hand and the lantern hooked on the left rail, and across both our knees was a black wool lap robe that Katie Yoder had stitched for me as a wedding gift. He did not look at me when he said it. He watched the road between the horse's ears, and he said, "You will say yes today." I did not answer him, so he said it again, quieter, which was so much worse. "Martha, when they come around and ask you, you will say yes." And I sat there with Katie's stitching lying warm across my knees, and I understood something for the first time in my life. My husband was allowed to demand that of me. There was nothing in our entire world that made it wrong. 4 miles of frozen road, 40 minutes beside a man I had promised myself to in front of 300 people. And one question waiting at the end of that road that I had already decided how to answer, right up until the moment he told me how I was going to answer it. Stay with me. Because what an Amish husband is actually permitted to demand of his wife is not what you are imagining right now. It is not what the title put in your head. It is smaller than that. It is quieter than that. And once you understand what it is, I promise you it is so much worse. My name is Martha. I grew up Old Order Amish in Gauga County, Ohio, and I left when I was 26 years old. This is Hannah the Amish Girl, the channel where women who got out finally say the things we were never allowed to say out loud. If you want to keep hearing them, subscribe and tap the like button, and tell me in the comments where in the world you are watching from. I read every single one of them. And while you are down there, tell me one more thing. What is the one thing in your life you said yes to when you meant no? Now let me explain the machinery, because you cannot understand what happened in that buggy until you understand the word that runs underneath everything in plain life. The word is Gelassenheit. There is no clean English translation. Yielding is close, submission is close, self-surrender is closer. Donald Crable, who has spent decades studying plain communities from the outside, describes it as the organizing principle of the entire Amish world, and I think that is exactly right. Gelassenheit is the idea that the self is the problem. Your wants are the problem. Your opinions, your preferences, your individual judgment, the part of you that says, "I think otherwise." All of it must be laid down. Not managed. Laid down. Everyone yields. That is important to say. The child yields to the parent. The young man yields to the ministers. The ministers yield to the bishop. The bishop yields to the church. Nobody in that world stands at the top of it and gets to want things freely. That is real, and I will not pretend otherwise. But the yielding is not distributed evenly, and a wife sits at the bottom of a very long ladder. So let me tell you plainly what a husband is permitted to require. Not the cartoon version, the real one, as I lived it. First, he is the head of the household. This is not a personality trait or a preference. It is doctrine, drawn from scripture, read aloud at nearly every wedding I ever attended, and it means that when there is a disagreement about the household, the final word is his. Second, he can require your agreement in public. Whatever was said in the kitchen stays in the kitchen. In front of the church, in front of the neighbors, in front of your own children, you present one mind. Third, he can require your appearance, the width of your dress, the color of it, the length of your prayer covering strings, whether your hair is entirely covered. If a minister speaks to him about how his wife looks, that is a failure of his headship, not yours. Fourth, he can require your time, the garden, the canning, the cooking for church Sunday when it is your turn to host, which in my district meant feeding somewhere near 200 people out of my own kitchen. He does not need to ask. Fifth, he can require your household's participation, which visits you make, which relatives you sit with, whose funeral you attend, and whose barn raising you bring food to. Sixth, he can require your silence. If he decides a matter is settled, it is settled. Bringing it up again is not conversation. It is hochmut, pride, which in our world was the root of every other sin there is. And seventh, and this is the one nobody outside ever hears about, he can require your yes at Ordnungsgemäß. Let me explain what that is, because everything depends on it. Twice a year, in the spring and in the fall, an Amish church district holds communion. But communion does not just happen. 2 weeks before it, the district holds what we called council meeting. It is a long day. The Ordnung, the unwritten code that governs every detail of how we live, is reviewed out loud, article by article. What is permitted, what is not, what has drifted. And then, at the end of that day, the ministers go around the room and every single baptized member is asked, individually, whether they are at peace with God, at peace with the church, and in full agreement with the Ordnung. Every member, one at a time, out loud, in front of everyone they have ever known. And here is the part that makes it a machine instead of a question. The answer must be unanimous. If one member says no, communion does not happen. Not for that person, for the entire district. Everyone waits. The matter has to be brought out, examined, resolved, and only then can the whole congregation go forward. One voice can stop 200 people. Karen Johnson Weiner, who wrote an entire book on the lives of Amish women, describes how much of the real weight in plain communities sits on women who have almost no formal say in it. That sentence took me years to be able to read without my hands shaking, because it is the shape of my entire marriage in one line. So those are the things a husband is allowed to demand. Now let me tell you what mine demanded. 4 miles from church, in the dark, with a horse in front of us, and nowhere for me to go. I need to back up 2 months. Katie Yoder lived across the road from us. She was 51 years old, she had 8 children, and she made the finest quilts in our district. She had stitched my wedding lap robe by lamplight the winter before I married, black wool with a plain gray binding, heavy as a person, and she gave it to me without ceremony the way she gave everything. Her 3rd son was named Amos. Amos had been baptized at 20. Baptism is the point of no return in our world. Before it, you can leave and the door stays open. After it, leaving means you have broken a vow before God and the church responds with Meidung, the ban. Shunning. Amos left at 23. He bought a car. And Meidung is not what people think it is. It is not that everyone stops loving you. It is far more specific and far more surgical than that. You may not take a meal at the same table as a member. You may not accept a ride from them or give them one. Business dealings are severed. It is designed to be a constant, quiet, unbearable ache, and it is meant to be an act of love, because the entire point is to bring you back. That October, Amos came home to help his father get the corn in, because that is who Amos was even after everything. And I was in Katie's kitchen that evening bringing over a pie, and I saw it with my own eyes. Katie set the family table, 8 places, and then she set a second table, a small square one, over by the window with 1 plate on it, and she fed her own son at it, in the house where she birthed him. She did not cry. She did not say a word about it. She put his food down in front of him and she went back to her own table, and she sat down with her back mostly to him. And Amos ate looking out the window at the dark, and I stood in that doorway holding a pie in both hands, and something inside me came apart quietly and did not go back together. I went home. I did not sleep. And over the following weeks something hardened in me that I had never felt before, and I did not have a word for it then. I have one now. It was not doubt, it was refusal. Council meeting was set for the 2nd Sunday in November, and I decided I was going to say no, not a speech. I had no speech. I was 24 years old, and I had an 8th grade education, and I did not know how to argue with a bishop. I only knew that when they came around the room and asked me if I was at peace, I was going to say that I was not, and that a woman feeding her own child at a separate table was the reason, and that I could not pretend otherwise in front of God. I told my husband 3 days before. He did not shout. I want to be very clear about that because I know what you are picturing. He was not a shouting man. He got very quiet, and he said we would talk about it, and then he did not talk about it, and I mistook his silence for the matter being open. It was not open. It had been settled. He simply had not told me yet. He told me on the way to church. There is a part of this story I cannot tell you here. Not on this platform, not under these rules. The algorithm has limits, and I have learned exactly where they are. So I wrote the rest down instead. Slowly, without the softening, without the cuts. Everything the camera is not permitted to show. The book is called The Ordnung They Never Wrote Down. 208 pages of what plain life looks like from the inside of it. The link is in the first comment of this video. That is where the part I could not say out loud lives. So, the buggy. It was 4 degrees that morning. The horse's breath came out in white clouds and froze on the harness in little beads. I remember the smell most because a closed buggy in November smells like wet wool and horse and kerosene and the inside of your own coat, and it is a small space, and there is nowhere in it to turn your face away. He had put the lap robe over my knees first, before his own. He always did that. I want that in this story too. We went 1.5 miles without speaking, and then he said it. You will say yes today. I said, I cannot. He said, you can. I said, it would be a lie in front of God. And then he said the thing I have carried for 11 years now. He said, if you say no, they will not have communion. 200 people. And by Tuesday, every family in this district will know it was my wife who stopped it. My wife, not Martha, my wife. And I sat there and I finally understood the whole shape of it. This was not about Katie. It was not even really about the ban. It was that a man's standing in that community is measured by whether the people in his house are in order, and I was a person in his house, and my conscience was a thing he was permitted to require. He did not raise a hand to me. He did not raise his voice. He did not have to. The demand was made in a normal tone by a tired young man holding leather reins, 4 miles from a church where 200 people were already unhitching horses. And it worked. We rode the last 2 miles in silence. I watched the fence posts go by. I remember counting them. And when they came around the room that day, and a minister I had known my entire life stopped in front of me and asked me if I was at peace with God and with the church, and in full agreement with the Ordnung, I looked at my hands and I said yes. 1 word. That was all it took. Communion went forward 2 weeks later. Nobody knew anything had happened. It cost the district nothing at all. It cost me 4 years. Now, I did not understand for a long time that this had happened to other women. That is the trick of it. Everything happens in a buggy. Everything happens in the 20 minutes when 2 people are sealed in a box on wheels with a horse in front of them and no way to leave, and then you both get out and you smile and you carry your dish inside. It was Lydia who told me. Lydia was 9 years older than me, and we were canning tomatoes in her kitchen in August, the whole house wet with steam, jars rattling in the water bath. And I said something small. I said something like, Ephraim does not like it when I have opinions on church matters. Lydia did not look up from the jars. She said, nobody's does. And then, after a long time, still not looking up, she said, mine told me in the buggy too. I said, told you what? And she said, that there was no need for me to answer any way but yes. And then she said, 19 years I have said yes. I do not know any more which of those were mine. I do not know any more which of those were mine. We put up 40 quarts of tomatoes that day, and we never spoke of it again. Not once. Not in the 6 years before I left. But I want you to understand what that kitchen was. That was 2 grown women confessing the central fact of their lives to each other over boiling water, and agreeing, without ever saying so, to never mention it a second time. That is what the silence does. It does not just keep you from telling the outside world. It keeps you from telling each other. And so every single woman in that district believed she was the only one riding home from church with her mouth shut. Here is the part where I have to be fair, and I am going to be, because I do not think you can understand any of this if I make him a villain. My husband was not a cruel man. He was 27. He had been raised by a father who never once asked his mother's opinion in front of another human being. He was terrified of Hochmut in himself and in his household, because he had been taught since he could walk that pride is the door every other sin comes through. He put the lap robe over my knees before his own, every single time, for 4 winters. When I miscarried in the spring, he did the milking alone for 11 days and never mentioned it, not once, to anyone. He was not demanding my obedience because he enjoyed having it. He was demanding it because he was afraid, and because the system had handed him a right he never asked for and gave me no right to refuse it. And neither of us had the words to say that out loud. That is the thing I most want you to hear. This was not a bad man in a good system. It was 2 ordinary people inside a machine that only ever gave one of them a voice. Years after I left, in a small office with a window that looked out onto a parking lot, I said all of this to a therapist for the first time. I told her about the buggy. I told her about the fence posts. I told her I had said yes. And she said, "So you were coerced." And I said, No, you do not understand. He never touched me, he never even raised his voice, he only asked. And she let that sit in the room for a while. And then she said, "Martha, a request you are not permitted to refuse is not a request." That is the whole thing. That is what I could not see from the inside of it for 26 years. So let me answer the question this whole video has been circling. What are Amish husbands actually allowed to demand? Not your body. That is what everyone assumes, and it is not the answer. The answer is smaller and it goes deeper. He is allowed to demand your agreement, your public face, your silence on a matter he has closed. And when the church comes around the room and asks you in front of everyone whether your soul is at peace, he is allowed to demand your answer, your voice. That is the thing, not taken by force, requested in a normal tone by a tired man holding a pair of reins in a space with no door. And the story is not the demand. The story is that he was allowed to make it, and I was not allowed to refuse it. And not one single person in 200 would have said he had done anything wrong. The plain world gave me things I still carry. A community that shows up before you know you need it. Hands that know how to work. Bread I can still make without measuring. A quiet in the early morning that I have never found anywhere since, and I have looked. But there is no scripture that makes a woman's conscience her husband's property. There is no Ordnung article that can put a yes in your mouth and call it peace. And there is no God I believe in now who hands a woman a soul and then requires her to answer for it in somebody else's words. Katie Yoder died 4 years ago. I was not permitted to go to the funeral, and I went anyway. And I stood far back near the fence line and nobody spoke to me, and that was all right. I did not go for them. That black wool lap robe is in the trunk of my car right now. It has been through 2 states and 1 divorce and a great deal of weather. I cannot bring myself to wash it. It is the only thing I took. If you grew up somewhere that your agreement was assumed before anyone asked for it, I see you. If you have ever said yes in a room full of people while everything in you was saying no, and then gone home and made supper and set the table and said nothing, I see you. That was not weakness. That was survival inside a room where refusal was not one of the available options. You are allowed to have an answer that is your own. You were always allowed. Nobody told you, and that was the entire point. If you want to read the version of this story that YouTube will not allow, the full pages are in The Ordnung They Never Wrote Down. First comment of this video. And that is everything. Choose your freedoms wisely. They might just save your life.